Welcome to Bible over Brews, deep thoughts fermented over time and text. Here we come tonight, Prophecy with Brian Godawa. I'm here, Aaron, Crew Juice Faverka, and I've got Gumby.
Hey, what's happening?
Mike.
Hi, everyone.
And George.
Hola.
He's going to be a resident skeptic.
I'm here. I'm ready. I'm ready for some good questions for you guys, so I'm ready to bring some heat.
Which is awesome. So, I'll be patching in Brian Godawa, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to also be pouring the beer and let Mike and Gumby talk.
Right on. Looking forward to the beer tonight.
Me too. I got appetizer pistachios, peppers, pistachios, and
Solid.
yeah. Now I'm ready to go. I'm a little thirsty.
Yeah, you were tearing those up, Mike.
So this is from Masthead, eh?
Yep.
This is Masthead.
And Masthead is an Ohio brewery, right?
Yes.
And I think, at the National Beer Competition, they just won some awards. I just saw it in the Plain Deal or something like that as well.
they're the real deal, man.
And I think Ohio has got a really good brewery scene as well. I mean, just even like in this area, right? Ohio City and everything like that. I mean, it's just like A-list up here.
Yeah.
Have you guys been to that Brick and Barrel place yet?
No.
I'm not.
It is down on, like really down in there in the flats by that bridge that raises up on Columbus Road. Like really kind of tucked down
Yeah,
there.
I think I know what you're talking about.
And real small. I mean, it's like, what I love about it is that like there's all these fancy places, and then it looks like this garage almost.
Okay.
Yeah.
But no, they have a lot of good beers, and then real strong too. I mean, I think they have like 3 that are over 9%.
Wow.
So yeah, I'd recommend it though. It's fun, and it's like they're local, business owners. It's cool.
Right on.
I think that's what's cool about this. You'd think you'd run out of beers to sample if you're just doing local like we are. Is not the case. They're popping up all over the place.
Absolutely, it's never ending. Seems like.
Yeah. And Gumby and I, we actually
Look at that.
went out
Oh, man.
and preemptively explored Masthead.
Thank you, Juicer.
So,
We
Mike,
did.
Yes, sir.
what kind of beer are we having right now?
Oh, it looks like we got smoked Ohio peach. Wow. Okay. So it's aged Belgian style wheat over 100 pounds of fresh Ohio peaches smoked with pecan wood. The process adds a touch of sweetness and a smoky character that blends with Belgian yeast esters and elevates the orange and lemon peel character, yielding a flavor yet elegant beer.
I have my first question for you guys.
Shoot.
Sir.
What's an ester?
An ester.
A Belgian ester.
Yeah, so the ester is like the flavor of the wood. It's actually an ester is more or
You
less
probably could have stopped there. I would have just believed you.
the flavors of the resins in the wood.
Okay, all right,
So-
all right.
I was going to go with you. Didn't hear the story of Esther in the Bible?
Yeah, I'd be like, oh, all right.
Come on.
Yeah, I don't know if I read all that.
Now,
right, but
now try this. This one so impressed Gumby and I. We had to make sure this was one of the ones we brought tonight.
yeah, I had a sip, and it is delicious. It's ABV 5.6 and IBU of 20, but the IBU, I don't know. I think that says it's a little high. It doesn't taste.
It's not exceptionally high. It's incredibly smooth. I like it's because it tastes like you are eating a peach next to a campfire.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And-
Yeah.
And see, I'm going to disagree. Actually, I'm not a huge fan of smoky beers. Actually, I'd say one of the worst beers I ever had was a smoky porter.
Okay.
And this one's not bad. I'm enjoying this one. But yeah, when I've had some like really smoky dark beers, and I'm like, I'll pass. It's actually a Mexican smoked porter. So it was a little, again, how we were talking about the jalapeno before we were, all right? Yeah, so it was spicy and
That's-
smoky, and I was
yeah.
like, no, thank you.
That's
it
an
was like,
identity crisis.
I
in
literally
the
quit
cup.
drinking beer for like a week.
Yeah.
But this isn't bad. This is light and smoky.
Yeah.
So I
This
like
one's
that.
late. It's a little hazy, probably because it does have the fruit inside of it, but
It's so different. I love
it's
it.
so smooth.
It is unique. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And like I said earlier, I really enjoyed their jalapeno. It was so good. But we had to pick 2 to bring back.
Right.
And so we went with this and later the
can't
that
say it,
coffee
can't say
stout.
it.
Oh, so good. So good.
Like you were mentioning, though, it's cool that like we have such a good beer scene that like they could try smoked peach or whatever,
Yeah.
interesting beers like this. It's fun, whether it's your thing or not. It's still
Yeah.
good to try or fun to try.
I really like it, but it's so smooth. you can
It's
drink
scary
it.
smooth.
Yeah, like I've almost finished my glass.
Right,
so,
it is
you
going
know.
down. Yeah, it's like Gatorade almost.
It
It's
is.
like it's quenching a thirst.
Yeah, it's scary smooth.
Yeah, it's like pop. I mean, it's really good.
It doesn't even have like a beer flavor. It's silky and smooth and goodness all the way around.
I don't know if I can have like 3 in a row. I'd like to change it up. I think, just because it is so unique. But it's really good.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. You know what else? Have you guys ever had that Bumbleberry blueberry beer?
Yeah.
Yes.
See, that I had like one of those at a bar. Like, oh, this is delicious. And then I bought a 6-pack. And then after 2, I was like, this is, I was
Yeah,
done
it's
with
way
it. Yeah,
too-
I'm with
it's
you. I think
sweet,
I could
yeah.
do one of these after that. I'm
Yeah.
probably done.
Well, and that's why it's nice. Gumby and I, we went down there and we did 2 flats,
Yeah.
and that's what was nice is the flats because they're only 6 ounces each, so you can sit there and you can do like 2 or maybe even 3 flats, and you don't get too toasted, but you get a good variety of flavors, and they have incredible variety of flavors there.
Yeah. You want to do that.
The food was good too. I very much enjoyed it.
They have a lot of barrels there, where I guess they actually use to brew.
Yeah, and they do actual barrel aging.
Yep.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is that how they get the smoky? I'm just assuming. I know that's
Oh,
how
yeah.
they do it in whiskey, right? So they do that with the beer too. Is that how they get the smoky?
Yep.
Yes, in there. Okay.
So you're going to be our resident skeptic.
Skeptic. You got it. Skeptic. One of those.
Skeptic.
Yeah, I'm here. So me and Juice, we always go back and forth. And we always have some intriguing conversations, and one thing you could always count on Juice too. I don't know why I'm staying up at late thinking about spirituality, but I could text Juice at 3 in the morning. Why does it say this? And then he'll actually text back. I'm like, he's awake? I'm like, I thought you were wanted to text you while it was on my mind, and then he just gets me right back, yeah.
Thought I had you.
So what is your background as a skeptic? Are you Christian? Are you atheist? What's
Yeah, you know what? And I don't know. Again, I'm not bringing my total A game today. I believe I am agnostic because essentially, I'm not going to deny that there could be a higher power. I just don't subscribe to the notion that it's what's written in this here book, and I just don't know if we have the capacity of knowing.
Gotcha.
So I believe that is it. I think that makes him an agnostic.
Yeah, sounds like it to
You
me.
could probably, somewhere there.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't. Yeah, I guess I could have Googled it, known better. But
But he is doing his due diligence. He
then starting to read. It's not an easy read, but yeah, trying to get there.
The reading the Bible?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not easy.
it isn't. How are you tonight?
Good, man. How are you guys? So sorry about so sorry about my possible delay, but I got back in time.
No worries. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Very honored, Brian.
Yeah, I'm actually excited. I've been diving into Tyron. I'm about halfway through now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, it gets better.
Well, he's been selling it to all of us, so we're gonna have to all line up for the books. So he's doing a good job.
I was talking you up already about your Hollywood career, and your first venture in was To End All Wars.
Yep.
So tell us, what brought you into the industry?
Yeah, Two End All Wars was my first movie that I got made. That was back in 2001 or 2002, and it was one of those situations where you break in with the best thing you could ever experience, and so it's all downhill from there. Because the thing about independent film is everyone's in it together. You're all helping each other out, and the advantage for someone like me as a writer is they don't have the money to pay other people to rewrite you. So you do all the rewrites for them, and you do all the fixes, and that means I end up getting the sole credit. And yeah, and I was, and plus it's the kind of movie that I'm probably the most proud of still of anything I've done. Because again, as an independent film, you also control the content, and the writer, the producer, and the director, we were all on the same page in terms of our worldview and in terms of our understanding of what we wanted to do. but the more you get into the studio system in Hollywood, the more you lose control and the more you get crap. So,
Well, you got to make the movie appealing to everybody, right?
yeah, and then therefore it appeals to nobody.
Yeah.
Or let's put it this way, the lowest common denominator, but it's often leaves you unsatisfied, I mean, there's good movies, there's good studio movies, but I'm just saying, yeah, you get, plus the kind of message, the kind of meaning that we put into the movies it's not as conducive to Hollywood messages. So basically, yeah, it's the thing I'm most proud of. It's a true story of prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war under the Japanese in World War II, and it just tells their story. It's kind of like a Schindler's List for the Allies in terms of the suffering that our soldiers had to experience under the Japanese. But it's more than a tale of suffering. It's a tale of redemption because it also talks about how the gospel actually comes into the camp and affects everyone and challenges them in how to love your neighbor and ultimately how to love your enemy and what does that really mean. So it's one of those really deep, rich stories that also is brutally honest and stuff. So yeah, very, 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 it was an honor to make it. And like I said, it's still my favorite thing that I've done.
Awesome.
Great.
That's incredible.
The for your independent film projects, please enlighten us. I know there's a few things you've done as far as things like horror and stuff like that. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. Well, after that, it was kind of an interesting experience because after it was a movie that was really well done, and we had a lot of interest in it. We even had Walden Films at the time. This is a while ago, but Walden Films was going to buy it and do an Oscar campaign and everything. But the problem was it was R-rated, and Walden, the owner, was committed to never doing R-rated movies, which is insane because what?
I was booing him.
It's insane because our movie is a perfect example of why there can be some really good R-rated movies. And Walden also was going to buy The Passion of the Christ when that was being made. They could have really gotten behind it, but he wouldn't take the movie. He's a Christian who owned the studio, but he wouldn't take the movie because it was R-rated.
Yeah.
Come on.
I also always find that a little bit odd because I feel like Jesus didn't create the rating system for motion pictures. So, like, why is it rated R as drawing a line?
Yeah.
So
And plus, like, the one movie that could be rated R, justly so, and most everyone would agree, and they wouldn't take it because of their standards, which it just shows you the hypocrisy and the silliness of the contemporary Christian standards. They're often not biblical at all, but nevertheless, and I thought, this is going to open my career, the big breakthrough, but actually, unfortunately, that's not what happened. It became a breakthrough for the director, but the writer kind of got left behind, and I had to start at square one again, and which is very discouraging and all that. But I did it, and so I just started calling people I knew and started trying to get work again, and it was like starting off at square one. But and from the years after that, I've done a few movies. One was I adapted the best-selling horror novel called The Visitation by Frank Peretti. That's a horror story about this cult leader who comes to town, and he's, and people start to think he's Jesus returned, and he's actually demonic and all this stuff. And, it wasn't that great of a movie. It was a low budget, and the director took it out of my hands and rewrote it. And he wasn't a Christian, so I didn't feel like he really understood the material well enough to really do it well. So, but still, a lot of people I know like that movie. If you want a good Christian horror film, it's in that genre, And I wrote a movie called Alleged, which is the true story of the Scopes monkey trial, but not from the typical perspective that you normally see it. And that movie's, it's okay. I think it shows you a different side of the Scopes monkey trial that you're not going to get anywhere else, and some true things that people don't tell you about it. So that was kind of fun. So, and I've done some documentaries that I wrote and direct. I wrote and directed a documentary on the wall of separation between church and state that got on PBS, actually.
Nice.
It's one of the few non-communist documentaries that got on PBS. And So I was kind of surprised and shocked, to be honest with you, but they did it, and so I've done a few things like that. But I've been in the independent realm, which is basically, rather than studio is when you start to get involved in the big money and all that stuff, and I've kind of stayed in the smaller realm again, where writers and directors and producers can have a little bit more control over the material. And it's been very, very satisfying, but it's also very hard to get movies made. So, in the course of those years as a screenwriter, I had to reinvent myself and find new ways to tell my stories, because as with every career, you always have some really low ebbs and years where you don't make much money. And it forced me to reinvent myself. And one of the ways that I reinvented it was to write novels. And so this is about 8-9 years ago. I had actually written a script about a Bible character that no one had done in decades. And I found this amazing research that was so cool and fascinating about Nephilim giants and all this stuff that a lot of people, I wasn't taught this stuff, but I studied it and I found out it's in the Bible. There's stuff about giants in the Bible, and this is really wild and freaky stuff. And I thought, no one had ever done this in the movie before. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote a screenplay about Noah. And this is about like 9 years ago or so. And shortly after that, I found out that Darren Aronofsky was trying to get his movie made, and I knew, okay, he's going to beat me on that. So I thought, I was wondering, did he find stuff that I found? So I thought I wanted my story out first. So I went ahead and wrote this screenplay as a novel, and that was my first novel, which was Noah Primeval. And that became the beginning of a series of novels called Chronicles of the Nephilim, which is now 8 novels. And basically what I do is I retell stories from the Bible where giants appear. And a lot of times they're mentioned, but you just sort of briefed over them. And a lot of people think it's just weird anomalies of history, but I actually think that there's a storyline, a theological storyline that's connecting, that I call the War of the Seed, or the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent type of thing. And so it's a messianic struggle throughout the text, and the epitome of that ends up in the promised land, where Joshua and the spies go and they say, the Anakim are in there, they're giants, right? We've heard that story, but what does that mean? Well, there's a very deep theological thing going on there that has to do with the harem, or the holy wars of Joshua, which were not real. They weren't like go in and kill everybody. It wasn't. There was only specific tribes, and these specific tribes that they killed everybody actually had these Nephilim ancestors there. And those Nephilim go back to the flood, and that goes back to the strangest passage in the Bible, which is Genesis 6. It talks about the sons of God, divine beings in heaven, come to earth, and they mate with women, and they bore them Nephilim giants, and these were the mighty men of old. It's this weird passage that I thought was the weirdest. Now, well, that's kind of the premise of the whole series. And what does that really mean? I never knew what it meant until I started studying it. And so Chronicles of the Nephilim is my way of I do what I call narrative theology. So I write theological novels. I write very entertaining, action-packed, sometimes romance, because I come from Hollywood background. So I'm employing my Hollywood storytelling to write fascinating, entertaining stories from the Bible, retelling them with a supernatural fantasy-type flair to them, right? Spiritual warfare, that kind of stuff. But I'm embodying theology in a way that makes it fascinating and interesting, rather than, for a lot of people it's boring. Theology is boring, but I try to embody it in the stories, right? And so that was the Chronicles of the Nephilim series that it's been over the last 8 years or so. And the most recent series that I've just launched is Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And what that is, that's the story. It's the origin story of the Book of Revelation. Most of the stuff today, if there are novels, we're all familiar with Left Behind, right?
Try to forget.
And most of the novels today about the end times, it's all about who's going to be the Antichrist, the Pope's the Antichrist, or this, and then they write these sci-fi conspiracy stories that read like Marvel comic book movies about what they think is in our near future, having to do with the Antichrist and all this stuff. Well, I have a very different view than that popular. I'll call it the Left Behind view. With the rapture and the tribulation, all that stuff. I have a very, very different view that ties it in with the first century. So I tell the story of the Apostle John writing the book of Revelation in the first century and how they understood it applied to that time period, which is very shocking to a lot of Christians, especially if they haven't been educated on it. But it's all based on historical research and theological research. And that's the genesis of this latest series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And the first book is called Tyrant: Rise of the Beast.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, it's a fun read. I liked your characterization. You brought in a good amount of characters from varying backgrounds in the story.
Yeah, the goal was to basically I wanted to explore. Okay, as a Christian, the first century is an amazing time period. We all know about the Book of Acts, but the one time period that I don't know about you guys. You probably are more educated than I was, but when I was younger, no one told me about the time period after the Book of Acts unto AD 70, which is the destruction of the temple and the holy city Jerusalem. No one ever taught me that. It was a jump from the Book of Acts to the Catholic Church or the Eastern Western split, and then the Reformation, all that kind of stuff. There's just this sort of like this period that no one taught me about, and I started discovering about it. And Josephus, the famous Jewish historian who lived through that time period, is the only resource we have. Well, the only exhaustive resource we have that describes what turned out to be a 3.5-year siege of the land of Israel by the Roman armies because the Jews revolted against Rome. So the Roman Nero, who was the emperor at the time, sent in his armies led by Vespasian and Titus, and they came in and basically demolished the land of Israel, ended up sieging and destroying Jerusalem and the temple, right? And we may have heard of that, but there's fascinating details about this history that no one but this one viewpoint of the end times was teaching. And so I was fascinated by history, and the viewpoint's called preterism. And preterism, basically, the word means in the past, and it's basically saying that the last days or the end times are in the past, which means that the last days are not the last days of the earth or the last days of the world. They are the last days of the old covenant. So it's a very localized interpretation of what that means. And it's a completely different paradigm that most Christians aren't familiar with. But as I explored that and discovered this stuff came alive to me. And so, like I said, I realized the theology of it is there's a lot to it. It goes deep and it goes wide. And many Christians don't have time to get into it or aren't interested. But I thought if I could tell this story, just tell the story of it and this whole siege of Jerusalem, and tell it through the perspective of a Roman, a Jew, and a Christian. And since this starts to occur in around AD 64, the series starts with the Great Fire of Rome. And many people have heard that there was rumors maybe Nero set the fire. We're not entirely sure, but there's a good chance that he probably did set the fire of Rome, or was behind it because he wanted to rebuild Rome in his own image. But then what happened was the people started to really suspect this, right? And of course, it doesn't matter that you're the emperor of the known world and that you're considered a god, because if the people rise up, as we all see even in current day, the mob can overthrow anybody, right? And so what he did was he decided to make a scapegoat of someone and blamed the Great Fire on the Christians. Why did he do that? Because they were going around saying that God was going to come back in vengeance and judge everyone, and he was going to come back with flaming fire. And what they didn't know was what the Christians were talking about was what Jesus prophesied, which was that God would come and destroy the temple in Jerusalem and the holy city of Jerusalem. But they sort of twisted that and made it go against the Christians, and that's what began the Neronic persecution of the Christians, which is where we've heard of Christians being thrown to the lions and all that. That's where that first began, the very first major persecution by at least by non-Jewish, by the Gentiles, because of course before that the Jews were already persecuting Christians in the Book of Acts, right? So that's kind of the beginning of the origin of all of it, and I found it so fascinating. And it's this whole, like I said, it's actually a 7-year period of Rome interacting with Israel, and so I have a Christian who is a woman, and she's a servant. She's it's kind of a slave of this Roman praetorian, and he's got a Jewish doctor who's helping him. He's sort of forced him to help him, and they are tasked by Nero. Nero has heard about this secret text that's been flowing around, which is the Book of Revelation, right? And in that text, it's anti-Rome, right? And it talks about the end of the world, and he thinks that it's an assassination attempt on him. So he sends this Roman guy out, find it, track it down, find out what it is, who they are, kill him if you have to, find out if there's someone claiming to be this Jesus Christ resurrected, and if you can find him, kill him. So that's sort of the story that launches the whole journey. And in the course of that, we travel around the Roman Empire, and we see through a Jewish eyes, through Christian eyes, and through Roman eyes how that world was like and what it was experienced. And that was kind of my goal, that was the entertainment side of it. While they're trying to find out what's this secret letter, let's track it down. That's, of course, the letter of Revelation, and that's where we start to find out what it means and what's behind it. So that's kind of the genesis of it all.
Okay. It's very well told, too. And that the persecution part is it actually left me riveted as I was listening, because it was so descriptive of what was happening to them at that time in the stadium.
Yeah. It's all based on research, too. I mean, I went back to ancient sources, got everything I could that people that wrote about it. And so everything you read about the persecution of Christians in that story is stuff that was claimed to have actually happened. And that's what's so shocking about it, because like you said, I mean, I was shocked at the kind of stuff that they did, Yeah. One of Nero's favorite things to do was to act out ancient pagan myths and stories in the arena that ended up with death. So he would, he would take like the myth of Daedalus, which they knew about. That was Greek, but still, Daedalus flew too close to the sun, right? So they would put Christians or people up on high places in the arena and push them off, and they just fall to the ground and crash, and blood splatters everywhere. That's the kind of stuff that he did, It was that, not just the lions and not just crucifying, but playing out these sick, twisted, macabre stories with that end in the deaths of Christians.
Yeah. Now, question on the giant. I forget his name. Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is that based on an actual story?
Yes, that's an actual character in history.
So is this a literal giant, or is this like? I mean, is this a giant as I would expect it on TV and movies?
Yeah, no, Gabaris.
That's it.
Here's what I did. In the book, and this is another thing because what you just say there, I knew that the stuff I was going to be telling was going to be so fantastic and wild that people would be reading and going, is he just making this up? Right. And especially when I'm going to be describing things like the Book of Daniel, the Abomination of Desolation. I'm saying this was it, it happened. And I knew Christians are going to be going, no way, he's making it up. So what I did was I footnoted the entire book. Each book is footnoted, so that if you're reading something and you're going, come on, really, find the closest footnote. And I've got as many footnotes as I do text of the novel itself, because I really wanted to sort of give people an opportunity. If you want to go deeper than just the story, you want to go deeper into the truth and facts and theology of it, you just read the footnotes, right? So there was actually a giant called Gabaris, I think is what it was called, Gabaris. And I think it's in, and I have the footnote back there, but I think it was in Tacitus or something. And he basically, he's described as a flesh-eating giant, cannibalistic giant. And I think he gave his height. They don't always give the height, but sometimes they do. Like Josephus gives an actual giant that he knew about and his height. And so I made Gabarus the same height as Goliath. So I can't remember if that's in the text or not. But he said he was a large man and giant man, and he ate flesh and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, and he was during the time he was under Claudius. And when Claudius, Nero was Claudius's nephew. So Nero must have known this guy at that time. So imagine if this guy's still alive, when Nero becomes emperor, he's going to be one of Nero's favorites from the past, right? So, yeah, that's an example of I have amazing characters of history that you would never believe it. So that's why I had to prove it by putting the footnotes in there.
That's awesome.
Wow.
And I think half of the book actually is footnotes, right?
Yep, half the book is, which sometimes disappoints people because they're like, I'm reading it, it looks like it's halfway through the book, and all of a sudden it's like, what? But one of the things about my writing is my fan base really, really seems to enjoy the research that I do. So in all the Chronicles of the Nephilim, that previous series I mentioned, I would have an appendix at the end of each book, and I would explain some of my research behind all the wild stuff. Because, like I said, same thing. I would find all this wild stuff in the Bible that I thought people think I'm making this up, but it's in the Bible. So I did that, and Christians, I got many people who said, look, I love the appendix as much as the novels. So I ended up putting all those appendixes together in one single book of just the theology called When Giants Were Upon the Earth. And that book has sold as well as any of the books in the series. But in this new series of the Chronicles of the Apocalypse, I go way beyond that because, like you said, literally I have the same amount of text and footnotes. So this isn't just like, oh, I footnoted the name of the book where I got that from. I'm actually copying and pasting chunks from what the scholars say so that people can learn more about it and see exactly where I got it from. So it's not just boring footnotes. It's actually like a story in and of itself if you want to go down that path.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Wow.
I love the When Giants Walked the Earth. That's a fantastic book. It might be my favorite in the series because
Cool.
I have the whole series.
Cool. Yeah, well, that was one of the things, when I first started this, look, this is years ago. I come from an evangelical Reformed background, but, basic evangelicals. And, look, I was worried because I'm thinking, man, the stuff I'm going to write about, I'm telling Bible stories. I'm going to be a heretic. They're going to call me a heretic, because I do all this mythological research. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to tell a story that weaves in the Bible and ancient mythology and history to show where that stuff comes from. Because, we have all these myths. They don't just pop out of nowhere. They're based on things that are probably true, but then mankind spins them and creates their own legends, right? So I wanted to sort of show, here's where all this stuff comes from. And when I was doing that, though, it was a real creative freedom for me because I would be scared. I was thinking like, man, am I playing with the word of God here, But I came to the realization that, no, I was doing what the ancient Jews actually did because the Jews have lots of texts that we now know. We call them the pseudepigrapha, and other Second Temple Jewish literature where what they used to do, they believed the scriptures were the word of God, right? But they still would take those characters like Abraham or Moses, and they would sort of expand and tell new legends. And the purpose was theological. They weren't trying to add to the word of God. They were just trying to say, we want to give some more stories, and we want to encourage with more stories. We're going to use our biblical characters. We're going to sort of tell our own legends, but they were trying to reinforce the theology that they believed in, right? And so I thought, well, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to try to keep it as close to the Bible as possible, so I'm not going to contradict the Bible, but I'm going to fill in between the lines with fiction that could at least connect the dots. I'm not saying it all happened this way. I'm not saying this is the way it is. And the other thing was I said, look, the Bible talks about this spiritual world, right? We got angels, we got demons, right? But it doesn't show us a lot about it. We have them occasionally entering into the scene, and in the New Testament, Paul writes about principalities and powers in the heavenly places that are fighting. We read in Daniel, we just get glimpses, right? Daniel says, oh, the prince of Persia, which is a spiritual entity over Persia. I went and fought with the prince of Persia. And you've got these principalities over the nations in the Bible. And we don't necessarily recognize it but there are some passages where it comes clear, like in Daniel, and that's where you get this idea that, wow, the ancient biblical view is that the earthly authorities, kings and princes and nobles or whatever, behind them were heavenly principalities and authorities. So whenever there was, like, for instance, when there was a war between two kings or two nations, they believed that there was a heavenly war going on as well. And this is how the ancients understood this, right? And they likened the gods to stars in the heavenly host. So there's a lot of this poetic connection going on there, right? Well, the Bible talks the same way, that there's, like in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 through 10, it talks about at the Tower of Babel, God separated the nations and placed them under the authority of the sons of God. And I'm convinced that these sons of God are the fallen sons of God because they worship them as gods, and God condemns them for doing so. And he says, you're going to be under their authority because you keep worshiping these false gods. I'm going to give you over to them. And he says, but I will keep Jacob for myself. So he paints this picture that the nations are under these territorial demonic entities, the sons of God who fell from heaven, and they worship them as false gods. So I said, what if the gods of the ancient world weren't just made-up beings, but they were these fallen angels and that people were worshiping as gods? And that's sort of the fictional deceit, but in a way, it's theologically true anyway. So I depict these gods of the ancient world as fallen angels, but they're being these gods of the world, right? And so that's the other element of all my series of novels, not just the Nephilim, but this new series in the Chronicles of the Apocalypse. I'm saying, okay, let's draw back the curtain and see what might that look like, and so you've got, who is Satan described as in the Bible? He's the god of this world. What does that mean, right? What did that mean? Well, if the world at the time, when you said the word world, whether it was cosmos or more particularly oikumene, it meant the Roman world. So when they were saying Satan was the god of this world, it was saying that he was the territorial authority. I believe he was saying that he was the territorial authority over Rome, and Rome was controlling everything, so he was the god of this world. But that would one day be undone by Messiah, right? And so this is this sort of paradigm that I'm operating with, and I bring it into the Chronicles of the Apocalypse as well, because when Messiah comes, he takes back the authority of the nations, and that's what allows the gospel to go forth. Because what does it say? Satan is bound. When Christ comes, he says, I bind the strong man. And what does that mean? Revelation 20, it says, it means that Satan is bound so he can't deceive the nations. So the gospel goes forth to the nations precisely because they're no longer under the authority of these demonic entities. God is now saying, I've taken the real estate back. Messiah is here, and he now owns the earth, and he's going to draw all men from all nations into the kingdom. And that's, of course, what the new covenant is. That's what Christ brought. But until that old system, the old covenant, is completely destroyed, then the new covenant comes in with Christ in the death and resurrection and ascension, but the old covenant isn't gone yet because the temple's still standing. So the Chronicles of the Apocalypse series, my novels, explains how this ending of the old covenant is finalized in the destruction of the elements of the old covenant, which is the Jerusalem, the priesthood, and the temple. When that is physically destroyed in history, since God is a God of history, God isn't a God of philosophy. He doesn't just say spiritual things like, Jesus went into the heavenlies and he once secured salvation, and now there's a new covenant, and the old covenant, circumcision isn't needed anymore. And imagine the Jews standing around there going, what are you talking about? It's still here. How can you just say that? God always performs in history what he is theologically communicating to us spiritually. And that's why the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem is so crucial to this New Testament, New Covenant story, because it's the final ending of that old covenant, and the new covenant then takes on. And of course, we know historically from that point on, until that point, Christians were still, they were getting out. Paul was getting around, but Christians were still sort of localized, and they didn't get out. And when the temple was destroyed, Christians were spread out, and then that's when the gospel started spreading like wildfire, and that's when Judaism also died, right? It never it would never rise again except in a bastardized, unbiblical form called rabbinic Judaism, which is not even biblical. So you could see how that's the whole end of that whole old covenant system, the old covenant world. It's the last days. It's the end of the age of the old covenant, and the new age of the new covenant is here. And that's kind of stop me before I keep rambling on. But that's sort of the theology of what's going on. And again, a lot of people might find that interesting, fascinating, new, fresh, but it can be heady, right? And I'm like, all right, I want to tell a cool story that can replace Left Behind series.
Well, I can see why evangelicals would have issues with it.
Yeah.
Especially, when you take away their chances for future prophecy being fulfilled, it takes away some things that they're looking forward to.
Wait, you guys aren't evangelicals, are you?
Hey, I grew up evangelical, so I get it, man. I totally get it.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I really felt when I first started out, I felt like, boy, I'm going to really have to prove this because I'm going to be attacked.
Yeah.
But to be honest with you, I have to admit, I was far more accepted than I realized, I have dominated. If you go on Amazon, you look at the book categories, you go to biblical fiction, and I dominate the top 10, top 20 with all these series because they're selling really well, and I guess I just have to admit there was a lot more acceptance from evangelicals than I had ever anticipated, and I'm grateful for that. But they also have appreciated me, giving the research because they want to learn and they want to, they're not happy with just a good story. They always like to have things explained to them, and that's not always a good thing, but sometimes it is, and that's kind of where I'm in that in between world where it's like, look, I like to tell the good story, but I'm okay to explain it to them if they wanted to explain. That's cool, and that's kind of what I do, and I think that's the unique niche that I have, at least in that realm. So,
do you catch a lot of it? Do you catch a lot of criticism from people that don't interpret the Bible or the teachings the same way as you?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, there's always going to be some fundamentalists who do, I'll take the Bible literally. I don't believe this. But there, in all honesty, in all these years, it's a handful of people. Maybe it's not. I may be a bestseller in biblical fiction in Amazon. It's not a huge category, okay? So I'm not selling hundreds of thousands of copies. And maybe if I got into that range of that kind of status, I might get more attention. I might get attacked more. Nevertheless, I've done very well. I've been selling very well, and I'm very happy and pleased with it. And so I'm surprised that I'd say, 1% of people have given me negative comments. I'm amazed.
Well, Brian, for the fundamentalist evangelical, what do you think the one issue the most they take with your books? What is there a common theme that they say, oh no, you cannot take that away from me? Yeah,
that's a good question. The few responses that it had, well, okay. Usually it's the sex and violence because that's the first thing, and that's the usual thing for evangelical Christians is they have a hard time with sex and violence and definitely no bad words. And I have a couple of those every once in a while where, I'm portraying evil and the world was very wicked. I mean, Genesis says that the intent of man's heart was only evil continually. That is pretty, and it says the world was so full of violence. That's why God destroyed it, right? So I wanted to depict it accurately, and so I do show some wickedness on all levels. I try to be. I'm not X-rated or anything like that, but nonetheless, it's R-rated at times, and that's been the most response that people say, "Man, it's just too much. I can't handle it, or I want to read this to my kids, but I can't." That kind of stuff, That's been the most response, and I respect that to be.
Well, that was the same thing for Passion of the Christ and Noah, right? Was people complaining about the violence and stuff like that? Right?
Well, yeah, the Noah movie was just. Honestly, I don't think the Noah movie. I don't think people had. Okay, Christians in general don't tend to have as much problem with violence. I can wax a lot on the hypocrisy of that. They have the problem no, really, they have the problem with the language
Yeah.
and
you're
sex.
That's true.
Right. You're right.
That's true.
Yeah.
I know they're
So-
even like in the most recent movie. I'm a big fan of the remake of It.
Yeah.
And if you read that book, there's a sex scene, and everyone was like freaking out about it. However, no one says a thing about the 6-year-old kid getting his arm bitten off, and then getting kidnapped. Yeah, right. Like
Yeah.
consensual sex, no. Kid getting his arm bitten off, no, not like, that's fine. That's fine. We can do that.
But it's interesting because I actually don't have a problem from a. For me, it's not a moral issue, but it is a market issue, and as an author, and I want to reach a wide demographic, and I've actually softened on my own. I got some of that out of my system. I'm like, okay, I'm going to show the wickedness of the world, man. If you don't like it, tough luck. But the truth is I do want more Christians to read it, and so over the years, I've adapted a little bit, and this newest series, I think I'm more balanced, and I think Christians will be able to handle Chronicles of the Apocalypse better than Chronicles of the Nephilim if they have a problem with that stuff. But to be frank, look, when you not censor, that's not a good word, but when you hold back on being too graphic, what it is, sure, it can be an artificial imposition of someone else's values, but it could also just simply be a way to be more creative. And this is the thing about the movies in the 50s and 40s and 50s when they first started the Hays Code in Hollywood, where they started saying, okay, you can't show all this and that. Well, the way that they got around it was to be more creative, and that's why some of the best movies ever for creativity is that. So what I'm saying is, knowing my demographic challenged me to say, okay, Brian, can you still deal with depravity and wickedness, but not be as graphic, but still communicate the impact? And I believe I've done so with this new series, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I still think that you got a sense of wickedness, and there still is some violence in there. It's just a little bit held back than it was in Chronicles of the Nephilim, if that makes sense.
What about from the theological point of view? Like, is there anyone pushing back and saying, hey, you can't move that prophecy? That it can't go there?
Yeah, there are definitely, and look, there are going to be people who give me a 1 star on Amazon only because they don't agree with the theology. It has nothing to do with with story.
Right.
My goal is to tell everybody is like, look, I'm not trying to prove this to you. I really just want to tell a great story, and this is what I believe. Mm-hmm. But I want to write it in such a way that you can still find it a fascinating story and learn about history, because I argue I'm being consistent with history. So you can learn about this history time period, learn about how the Bible was understood in that time period. You don't have to agree with the theology of it. That's my goal. So my goal is for people to say, wow, I really enjoyed the book. I don't agree with the end times view, but really good story. And I've gotten some of those people, and I've gotten a few people who are just like, this is heresy because preterism's heresy, and they won't even read anything, but not that many, But then again, I think that crowd who's really into Bible prophecy, end times, they just read their own stuff, and they just want to read the latest description of who the Antichrist is.
I agree. I agree. It's almost comically incestuous if you that crowd.
Yes, if they get a hint that it's got a preterist viewpoint, it's like they're not going to go near it. It's heresy to them.
Yeah,
and so they won't even look at it. And that's why I try to tell people up front. I don't want to trick them. So I kind of let it known, like, okay, this is a story. Here's what it's about: Nero and about Christians in the first century, and it talks about the Book of Revelation, how it applies to the first century. So at least they get an idea before they enter it. I don't want them to read it and go, "Hey, what is this? I don't like this." So I try to do that, but I also feel like don't be so hung up. You don't really have to. You don't have to agree with me. It's still a great story,
Right.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought in an effort to, and not that I want to if you have your vision, that's art. That's good. Have you ever thought, in an effort to reach more a broader audience, have you ever tried creating something that maybe with like more subtle undertones of Christianity, or maybe something that's implied that could be found later instead of like something that's very forward? And
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question because I actually, when I started out in Hollywood, that was my goal, I want to write secular movies, and I have a Christian worldview, but I don't necessarily need to have a Christian message or whatever. But it so happened that the first movie I wrote, it was a true story, by the way. Someone gave the book to me, and it just so happened it was about a Christian. But I argue To End All Wars is probably the best secular movie that has a Christian worldview in it. There's a few of them now that I would definitely argue that I like, but I believe it's one of the best. So my goal in writing in making Hollywood movies was actually to do that. But you also have to do the work that you get paid, and the things that came my way started to be that. And when I came up with the idea of writing novels, I never wanted to tell Bible stories. I always thought, why would you want to write a novel about a Bible story when you just read the Bible? That's silly. So I actually didn't want to write Bible stories, but so my whole interest was simply, I discovered this storyline thread of the Nephilim and the Watchers and the War of the Seed. It was this exciting thing it's called Christus Victor, which is a theory of atonement, and it's Christ against the powers. And that's what this storyline was that I found. And I'm like, I just want to tell this because I find it fascinating. So I don't actually have an agenda for anything. I don't have an agenda for Christians, non-Christian. I'm just telling a great story in the Bible. I don't really care who reads it. So in truth, it's kind of funny here. I've ended up becoming this author of Bible stories. And look, let's face it, Christians are the ones who are mostly interested in that. So when I write my stories, I don't care who's writing it. I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm just trying to tell a great story. And I have unbelievers, I have believers. So I don't really have an agenda. I do have an awareness of my market, but I don't if this makes any sense, I don't write Christian stories. I just write great stories, and I have a Christian worldview, and these happen to be about the Bible. So yeah, but there's no agenda. So yeah, that's how I approach it. However, I will say this. Because I've always been a bipolar in my creativity and my theology. So I've always been someone who loves the intellect, but I also love the imagination. And so I've struggled with that throughout the years because you tend to either be one or the other, but you feel bipolar when you love them both. So I love studying theology for hours and hours about weird, obscure things that nobody else cares about. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And then I love the imagination. I love watching movies and writing stories and all this, right? So all that happened was I studied this end times theology for years, and it just sometimes I wondered if it was a waste of time, But what happened was I was like, wow, if I can embody this into my storytelling, so it's like the perfect combination of I just want to tell a great story, and I want to tell a story with this theological edge to it. That's all. It's like theological narrative, So I don't know. It's hard to describe. It's a good question, but if it makes any sense, I'm technically not. I don't have an agenda of trying to persuade or slip in or be subtle. I just this is the best way to tell this story, and I'm not going to be. I'm just going to tell what works the best. And if being bold or being outright, being explicit works the best, I'll do that. If being subtle works the best, I'll do that too. But it just so happens that when you're dealing with stories about the beginning of the Christian church, it's going to be explicit. So it doesn't really matter.
That's true.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed all of them. I first dived into the Chronicles of Nephilim from Heiser's work, actually, because it was brought up on one of his podcasts in one of the chat rooms. And I said, is this any good? And he's like, oh yeah, I highly recommend it. And so I went through the whole series, and
cool,
and loved it. And I would even grab the Kindle book, and then I would also grab the audio book to listen while I was driving, so I could do both at the same time.
Cool, man. That's cool. Yeah. Look, I see myself as sort of, I'm like the narrative version of Heiser's theology, because his book, I had read his book when he was first just working on it, because before, like, now he's sort of well known, but before and that book actually made him well known, I think. So he's sort of exploded on the scene here. But before he was even known, he had that book for free PDF online, right?
Right.
So I somehow discovered it online, and that's what, and so it was the unseen realm before it was the unseen realm. That's what opened it up to me, and that was what inspired me to actually write the series in a way. And so I kind of see my novels as being the embodiment of his theology, you know, in a very real sense. Now I've drawn and studied lots of other scholars, but he was sort of the doorway that opened it up. You know, but I also tend to agree with him more than most anybody else. You know, I look, I'm not into there's what I call the Nephilim nuts, you know, and there's this whole underground conspiracy theory world of people who just read everything about giants and Nephilim and all this kind of stuff, and I appreciate it, and I have some common interest, sure. But I think a lot of that stuff is just obsessive and wasting time. Michael's more of like a responsible version of addressing weird things. We got to address them, and sometimes it's not what we think. And let's face it, there are giants, but look, they're not 20-footers. All right, they're like 7. No, really, and biblically, they're 7 to at most 9 feet, and that's it.
I agree.
You know, that kind of stuff. You know, and I mean, there's even a strong scholarly argument based on the Septuagint that Goliath was only 6'9", not 9'6". So you know, and I have no problem with that. He's still tall compared to the 5'5" average of that time period. That's a giant, right? Yeah. Because a giant is not what we think it is. We think of Jack and the Beanstalk when we hear the word giant, but to them, the word Nephilim simply means mighty warriors that were tall. You know,
Gibborim.
So, Gibborim, yeah. Well, Gibborim is actually a word that means mighty warrior, and so David's mighty men were called Gibborim too.
Yep, that's true. So
the Nephilim were Gibborim, which means Nephilim actually means giant, and it does mean tall person, but it says that the Nephilim were Gibborim, which means mighty men, if that makes sense. Yeah. So anyway, so I love Heiser, and I love how he doesn't go down the pathways of kookiness, and I tend to be in his camp. You know, it's like, okay, this stuff is really, it's there in the Bible, but this obsession with, you know, like, in fact, I'm on his podcast called Paranormal.
Great podcast.
Once a month I'm on there with a couple other people, friends of his, like from different, we're all in different sort of realms, just getting a layman's view, but we look at scholarly literature that has to do with paranormal things. Nice. And eventually one day I'm sure we're going to talk about like the elongated skulls. You know, in the Nephilim nut crowd, the elongated skulls of Brazil is a very, you know, those are Nephilim. And you know, I don't believe that. I don't. You know, I believe that it may have something to do with them trying to mimic something that was spiritual. You know what I'm saying? That might be connected, but those aren't Nephilim, right? So we debunk a lot of that stuff while at the same time saying, okay, but look, there is weird stuff in the Bible, and maybe there's more to this picture than what our rationalistic, post-enlightened scientific minds like to reduce everything to material, right? And that's kind of cool.
I agree.
Join us for the rest of the conversation in part 2.